Ford became firm favourites with fleets and families alike in the 60s with cars like the Cortina, launched in 1962. It ran for 5 generations, culminating in this, the Mark V, or the Cortina 80, introduced in 1979, which ran until 1982 before being replaced by the jelly mould Sierra, a controversial replacement in as much as it only came available as a hatchback and estate. And in fact, it took Ford a further 5 years to reintroduce that classic 3-box saloon shape with this, the Sapphire of 1987. Let's take a drive in these 2 family favourites to see what they're like today. So here we are in the twilight years of the Ford Cortina. Now, back in 1976, Ford replaced the Coke bottle shaped Mark III with the Mark IV edition. It's squarer, frankly it's blander line, did afford it a larger glass area, but it did lose some of that distinctive styling from the Mark III. But in many other regards it was largely a carryover car. The suspension and steering were tweaked slightly, and there was a laminated windscreen, but other than that there wasn't huge amounts of changes. There was some further tweaks in 1979 though, with this, the Mark V, or the Cortina 80 as it became known, and Ford has spent another £50 million updating it, although you'd probably struggle to see where they'd spent the money. But in truth, the glass area was even larger, giving it a slightly airier cabin. The door apertures had been increased. The suspension had been further enhanced with reduced spring rates at the front and higher spring rates at the rear, and a thicker anti-roll bar, which was meant to improve ride and handling. Those were the sort of subtle tweaks from an engineering point of view. And then from a styling point of view, we got slightly rounded off front indicators and headlights, a new smoother, more aerodynamic grille, new tail lights, and a few little other detail changes. The fascia was largely carried over, which in itself is the facelift Mark III from about 73 onwards. So a very sort of well judged sort of update, and in truth the exterior changes largely brought the styling into more a family look that started with the Mark I Fiesta of 1976, the Mark II Granada of 77, then this, and then of course the Mark III Escort of 1980. So that just brought the family resemblance there. The engines were all carried over. You got the 1.3 cross-flow, you got the 1.6 and 2 litre Pinto units, and higher spec models had the 2.3 V6 available should you wish. And there was the 4-speed manual box or a 3-speed auto. And then there was a choice of models. You could go with a base, an L, a GL or a gear. The S model that was in the Mark IV had been phased out, but you could opt for an S pack on any of the derivatives, which effectively gave you some slightly sportier, stiffer suspension, sports fog lights at the front, and a sporty gear knob, would you believe? How's that for decadence? So that was the model in a way. That was a saloon and an estate car, and you know, a very cautious, conservative update, but it really did work. Prices started from about £3,400 and topped out at about £5,700 for the gear model. That's about £25,000 in today's money. Quite remarkable when you think of it like that. That cautious, conservative with a small C approach did well for the Cortina. It was a tried and tested recipe. This is the ham, egg and chips of the automotive world, and people really loved it, and it continued to sell well. And that was despite the encroaching opposition, particularly the Mark II Vauxhall Cavalier, which came with front-wheel drive by 1981, so was definitely a more modern alternative to the now rather dated Cortina. Ford prolonged the life of the Cortina with special editions like the Carousel and the Huntsman and the Crusader, but ultimately the life ran out in July 1982, by which time over 1.1 million Mark IV and Mark Vs had been produced. Quite extraordinary. And then it was replaced by the Sierra, remember, as only a hatchback and an estate. And that controversial styling meant that the Cortina continued well on after it technically came off sale, and there are stories of the Cortina still finding homes at dealerships well into 1983, and of course that familiar Mark V shape lived on throughout the 80s with the South African built Ford P100 pickup truck. So what's it like to drive? Well, in truth, I really like it. The suspension is this tried and tested double wishbone suspension at the front and semi-rear trailing arms, and you know, it really works. It's got this lovely soft corsetting ride. It might not be the most nimble of things, but actually I think it feels quite solid. It's rolling, but it's not ungainly to drive. It's actually quite nice. The steering, is a lot of Fords of this era kind of lack a bit of feel in honesty, but it's easy to drive. It feels quite light and manoeuvrable. The 4-speed manual box is exactly how I remember it from back in the day. It's got this sort of light, slightly notchy feel, but it's precise and actually quite nice to use, I think, you know, when it's all set up properly. And the Pinto engine is nice. It's torquey at low speeds, which means you can sort of pull away without having to rev it hard. It just makes quite nice, gentle progress. And this fascia, while it's arguably quite basic and maybe a bit dated by the turn of the 80s, it does all work. You know, the gauges are clear and the ergonomics are well here with the vents, and the ventilation system controls all close to hand and all the auxiliary switches. I even like the high window winder handle here, sort of closer to you rather than having to reach downwards. It's right there for easy access. So you can so tell why the Cortina was a success. It delivered everything you needed it to do. And yeah, what with Ford's dealer network and marketing might, there's no wonder the Cortina was a huge success, and no wonder that they then subsequently struggled when it came to the Sierra. Safe to say, Ford's Cortina replacement, the Sierra, introduced in 1982, didn't get off to the best of starts. That radical styling and the fact that it was only available as a hatchback or an estate meant that its appeal was diminished, certainly with British buyers, and sales took something of a tumble. And if it wasn't for Ford's aggressive discounting, those first couple of years of on sale would have almost certainly been a hell of a lot worse. And so the facelift Sierra of 1987 couldn't come soon enough, quite frankly. There were 77 altered body panels and 1,200 new components, and that manifested itself very much in its slightly more coherent and curvaceous styling. So you've got these new headlights and wraparound indicators, a new softer nose and a reprofiled tailgate, tail lights and new bumpers all round, and the interior was subtly overworked with a different steering wheel and slight tweaks to the switchgear. And crucially, of course, with the Mark II, you got this, the Sapphire. The traditional and still in demand 3-box saloon shape was reintroduced. It was given the Sapphire nomenclature, and it was given a slightly different appearance at the front with the shorter bonnet and a traditional looking grille. Ford could finally offer saloon, hatch and estate to family and fleet buyers alike. And the funny thing is about the Sierra, of course, is that despite all those shenanigans with the styling, is that it was still relatively conservative under the skin. If anything, it was more conservative than the Cortina it replaced. Out had gone the wishbone suspension, and instead we got traditional McPherson strut suspension up front. But the engines were largely carried over. You got the 1.6, 1.8 and 2 litre Pinto units. There was the 2.8 V6 Cologne engine that quickly became the 2.9. So all the mechanicals were very much tried and tested. Shortly after the facelift Mark II and Sapphire came out, we then got a few more tweaks to the armoury. The 1.8 became the 1.8 CVH lean burn engine, which someone told me actually was a basis for the later Z-Tech engines. I'm not sure if that's true. Perhaps you can let me know in the comments if that's a vicious rumour or not. The 2 litre Pinto unit was then replaced in 1989 by a double overhead camshaft i4 engine, which is what's under the bonnet of this particular car actually. And the 2.3 Peugeot derived diesel engine was finally replaced by a 1.8 turbo diesel, therefore taking a more compelling fight back to Peugeot with its 1.7 turbo and 1.9 normally aspirated diesel engines. And of course Sierra had a bit of halo success with the XR models in the hatchback form, and then latterly the Cosworth, and the Sapphire got the Cosworth name badges in 1988, culminating in the Sapphire Cosworth 4x4 version with its 2 litre turbocharged engine and 200 plus horsepower. That was probably the halo car that the Sierra needed to have to maintain its appeal. So Ford did gradually add more and more changes throughout the years, but by the time you get to the late 80s, it's definitely clear that the Sierra is looking a bit long in the tooth. Remembering its mechanicals, a lot of it still spawns back to the Cortina of the mid-70s. Production was split in the early years between Dagenham and Genk in Belgium, but by 1990, when a facelift came along, all production moved over to Belgium, and what you saw is a facelifted Sierra and Sapphire with white indicator lenses at the front and smoked tail lights at the back, and further tweaks to the fascia. But we were definitely in the dying moments of the Sierra by then, and by 1990, don't forget, the Vauxhall Cavalier, which had already kept the moral high ground with the Mark II, had been replaced by an even better car, the curvaceous Mark III. And Ford did its usual trick of prolonging the life of the Sierra with some special editions like the Chasseur and the Azura. So that just kept the life going a little bit longer before finally being replaced with the all-conquering Ford Mondeo, a true world car sold globally, and its competence with its all-new engines, its lovely styling and excellent dynamics and engineering fronted by Richard Parry-Jones meant it was a critical success as well as a sales one. But going back to the Sierra, it's really interesting. The sales were a flop in those first generation years. There's no doubt that the buying public needed to get used to the styling. But as soon as the Mark II comes out in 87, sales do take a turn, and in fact 88 and 89 were the Sierra's best years in all of its life. And by the time it was replaced by the Mondeo, they had sold over 1 million, so not too dissimilar to the numbers borne out by the Mark IV and Mark V Cortina. The car we're driving here is a 1989 2-litre GLS model. That was the kind of warmed over version, so if you couldn't quite stretch to an XR4i or XR4x4, you could get this, the 2-litre GLS, and this one's got the i4 double overhead camshaft engine. And I've got to say, it's a nice engine actually. It's got a decent performance to it. It's quite refined. It's got the sort of torquiness of the Pinto engine. Non-power assisted steering, so it's a little bit twirly, a little bit woolly, a bit like the Cortina. But again, it's light enough and manoeuvrable enough at sort of slow speeds to make it, easy to drive. It's certainly not a handful. I think the ride's a bit crashier compared to the Cortina. It's definitely feeling it. We're not having those more compliant double wishbone suspension. But yeah, the Sierra, I don't know. It was a gamble, but it was a gamble that ultimately Ford lost, I think, because it meant those early years they just lost their sales dominance. And if it wasn't for the fact that the Mark III Escort claimed the top spot, Ford may well have lost out entirely in terms of market share. So yeah, I like the familiar surroundings of the Sierra. It's a good car. It's a shame Ford's gamble with radical styling didn't pay off, but to credit to them, not only did they respond by introducing the Sapphire, but they stuck with it. They persevered, and that perseverance did ultimately pay off. Ford maintained its sales dominance throughout the 80s despite its travails with the Sierra. As for which one I would take home, I don't really know. I don't know, in truth I'd have either. I really would. I'm such a dyed-in-the-wool Ford man, I would have either. I think I like the authenticity of the Cortina more. I think if I was really pushed, I would take the Cortina Mark V home, despite its end-of-line attributes, and it doesn't have the exciting styling of the Mark III. But I don't know, the Sierra Sapphire is probably rarer, if anything. Probably hasn't survived in the numbers of the way that the Mark V has. I think it's just the fact that this probably doesn't quite drive as well. It's more refined and sophisticated inside, but it's probably not as comfortable to drive. And I love that sort of slightly more basic interior of the Cortina. There's something really lovely and functional about it. But yes, I don't know, choosing is hard. I think I'd be very interested to know your views about either the Cortina or the Sierra. Yeah. Was the Sierra really a misstep, or should Ford have been given more credit for taking a gamble with the styling? Well, let us know in the comments. In the meantime, hope you've enjoyed the video. Thanks very much for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, select that bell so you're notified when there's new videos up. We appreciate all your support. Thanks very much for watching, and we'll see you again next time. I bloody love this.
Do you?
Yeah, I really do.
It's very you. I like these. They're excellent. Where's the other GoPro gone?